now by the Conservatives' Chris Philp and Mark Littlewood from the free market think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to both of you. Chris Philp, doesn't your party look a bit ridiculous today? Ed Miliband comes up with a policy and you call him a Marxist. 4 years later, you come up with a very similar policy and you call it a fair deal.
No, the policies are completely different. Ed Miliband proposed to freeze prices regardless of whether global markets went up or down. This is a cap set by Ofgem in response to markets to make sure that energy companies don't rip people off. So the price might go up, it might go down, but the point is it'll be fair. And the Competition and Markets Authority recently found that big energy companies were overcharging consumers to the tune of 1.4 billion a year. And what this does is help ordinary families, the just about managings. It is making real what Theresa May said on the steps of Downing Street, that we're here to support ordinary families.
I suppose the only difference, which you have just admitted there, is under your policy, under the Conservative policy, energy prices could actually go up.
Well, look, if global markets go up, you can't defy that. If the wholesale price of gas or coal or oil doubles, you can't stand in front of that, as Ed Miliband wrongly claimed you could. What this will do, however, is it'll make sure that energy companies stop ripping off consumers. And the Competition and Markets Authority found they're ripping off consumers to the tune of 1.4 billion a year, and we're going to stop that.
Right. Was David Cameron wrong, though, to call Ed Miliband's policy Marxist?
Well, no, he wasn't wrong, because what Ed Miliband proposed...
What's Marxist about it that's not Marxist about yours in terms of intervening in the market?
Well, I just explained that, because Ed Miliband said he would freeze it regardless of market conditions.
A freeze and a cap, Chris Philp, I mean, it's semantics,
it's not
really,
semantics,
isn't it?
It's fundamental.
It is intervening in a market. And we had David Cameron criticise it, Boris Johnson criticised it, the Defence Secretary Michael Fallon said Ed Miliband's policy would be the worst state intervention since Labour tried to control the price of bread in the 1970s.
Well, it would, because a freeze, regardless of market conditions, is totally different from making sure prices are fair. Now, it is an intervention in the market. You are right to say that.
Right.
Now, generally, I do believe...
That was the criticism of Ed Miliband at the time.
Well, it was completely unrealistic what he proposed. Look, but I do generally believe in free markets, but sometimes markets don't work. And this market is not working, and the Conservatives are prepared to stand up for ordinary working people, just as Theresa May said we would, and I'm proud that we're proposing this policy.
And in the same way that Ed Miliband said he would. Do you see the difference that Chris Philp has explained in terms of the freeze and the cap?
It's a bit of a nuanced difference, because in both cases, Ed Miliband and now the Conservatives are engaged in price fixing. Whether or not I would describe that as Marxist, I'm not sure, but it is extremely stupid and very bad economics, in my view.
Why?
Because the unintended consequences of this is even presuming that the regulator will be able to determine a fair price. The idea that these enlightened bureaucrats around a table can work out what the standard variable rate will be, I think is heroically optimistic. But if they set a price, you will have all sorts of unintended consequences. Very likely, I would suggest, the very lowest tariffs that a good number of people switch to, lazy people like me never get around to it, but people who really are on a tight budget can get a much better deal if they're just willing to spend a few hours switching. Most likely, those prices will start to compact, so you will have less price competition in the market within tariffs and between companies.
Right. I mean, but the reality is not enough people do switch, and that's the point, which is why Ed Miliband and Theresa May are both trying to make arguments that it's worth intervening in the market. And if that is the truth, it's the only way to put pressure on these companies.
Well, I don't know what the optimal number of switchers is.
Well,
I mean, do we
a vast majority.
Yeah, well, the vast majority don't switch, but that's actually true of nearly all markets. I mean, very few people always switch to the cheapest brand of cornflakes or the cheapest brand of cola. You only need a certain proportion of switchers in order for the market to actually be competitive. You don't need everyone to do it.
That is true, but in Tesco, everyone pays the same price for cornflakes. Here, those who switch get a much cheaper price, but the two-thirds of people who don't switch get charged a much higher price, and it's that unfairness that we're trying to tackle.
But at a flick of a switch, they can change that. The free market does...
But the fact is they haven't.
The free market does not preclude people being lazy. The free market does not preclude people not getting the best deal that is on offer. Quite often people don't get the best deal. Sometimes you'll buy 3 bottles of wine for the price of 2. Sometimes you won't take advantage of that offer. Those differences are completely natural and apply across all markets. They're not unique to energy.
But where the government can help, as it can here, I think it's right it does. And this is not a small problem, and it's not wine, which is a discretionary purchase. It's fundamental, it's energy. And 17 million of our fellow citizens are getting overcharged by big energy. And in this case, I think it is right the government steps in and does something about it.
What we saw, Chris, was when we actually liberalised the energy market in the 1990s and in the early years of this century, we actually saw a free market, a liberalised market, with prices going down, not just because of prevailing commodity prices. Since then, we have had government intervention upon government intervention, tariffs, levies, all sorts of rules about how many different types of tariffs you can possibly impose, often with going in different directions. I mean, only a 5% VAT, but then having to whack on climate levies.
Right.
It's been a mess. The market is broken because the government has intervened.
Owen.
Well, I mean, firstly, voters aren't lazy. They're just busy. They've got busy lives. They've got families. They've got jobs. They've got other things to worry about rather than hunched over a computer trying to work out different prices of different companies.
And actually, the energy companies, of course, benefit from that.
Of course they do. So I don't think that's a fair assessment. But what I would say is this. The difference is in terms of what Ed Miliband went into the last election with, which wasn't some arbitrary freeze, by the way, and what you're proposing is very, very nuanced indeed. And what I would say to you is it was deeply unfair and I think insulting when it comes to how public debate is conducted in this country to call it communist and Soviet and all the rest of it. And the point I would make to you is we were right about that. And if we were right about that broken market, we were also right about the broken housing market where the state has let the market run riot. We're right about an industrial strategy where we should learn from Germany, for example, where the government have intervened to support new industries, which we failed to do in this country. So extend the principle. Let's see if you really mean it.
And are you going to? I mean, you have broken the link with intervening in this market. Will you do the same on others?
I think where there are markets that don't work, the government will act to take care of ordinary families who are struggling to make ends meet.
You might do it on
and here is an
housing.
example. Well, in housing already, the government in the last year or so has announced something like £7 billion of funding to build new affordable homes. So that is a form of intervention.
Should
and
it
it's
go
right
further?
to do that. Well, look, I think £7 billion is a huge amount of.
Pitiful.
It's a huge amount. It's a huge. Oh, and it's a huge amount of money.
Look, we
it's a
spend
huge
just
amount of
quickly,
money.
just
Hang on,
take- as an example,
hang on,
just-
if you go too far,
No.
as you were suggesting a minute ago, you risk crowding out private enterprise, crowding out job creation. So I think there is a limit to how far you should intervene.
Right,
and this is a
but
reasonable
but
step.
you're still intervening. All right, Owen.
We spend £9 billion a year, more than that now, subsidising private landlords in this country because of the failure of your government for the last few years to build the housing that this country needs.
And the Labour government
Well, hang on,
preceding
house
it,
building has
admittedly,
gone up hugely under the Conservatives.
No, it hasn't.
It was
Lowest
100
level since the
it was a
1920s in peace
nonsense.
times.
The lowest level was in 2009
Chris,
under Labour.
It
Over the
has
last few
not
years.
gone up hugely, but we're not going to have a housing. We're not going to have a housing discussion here because we're going to stick to the energy price freeze or cap, as you call it. One of the other things, the unintended consequences that you mentioned, Mark Littlewood, your cap applies to the 17 million families, Chris Philp, who are on those so-called standard variable tariffs. That's about 2/3 of households. So how do you know that the energy companies won't simply recoup their losses by hiking up the prices massively for the third of families on other tariffs?
Well, there are two or three reasons. Firstly, the Competition and Markets Authority identified £1.4 billion of excess profits. Their profits went up by £1.1 billion last year. So I think, first of all, their profits will get squeezed. And it's right they do. The CMA found that. Secondly, I think...
So you want to squeeze the profits of companies?
Because the Competition and Markets Authority found they were making excess profits because they have a market-dominant
It's just
position.
not a very conservative thing to do, is it? To then absolutely castigate Ed Miliband for a policy that now seems to be extremely reasonable.
Well, his policy was different. And I think standing on the side of ordinary families, helping people who are only just about managing, is a very conservative thing to do. And I'm proud that we're doing it.
Right. I mean, do you think it will actually be popular in the way that Ed Miliband's, certainly the basis of it, was popular with voters?
Actually, when you do ask opinion poll questions in a kind of one sentence, one question, you know, would you like your energy bill to be cheaper? We'll fix it for you. Would you like your holiday to be cheaper? We'll fix it for you. Unsurprisingly, the overwhelming majority of people say that sounds great. What I'm more interested in is, assuming the Conservatives win this election, which looks likely, and assuming that they are foolhardy enough to go ahead with this policy, how are we going to look a year later at whether it has worked? How are we actually going to measure in 12 months' time whether the average family, or more importantly, the poorest families, those who really do take the time to switch because those extra few pounds are vital to them, how are you going to measure whether this has been a success or a failure
All right, Chris
12
Philp.
months hence?
Well, it's often not the poorest families that switch because it does require a certain
what will
amount
the
of time.
measures be of success?
Well, look, I think a measure of success would be the Competition and Markets Authority finding that there are no longer excess profits and average bills falling. So if we sit here in a year's time and average energy prices have fallen by £50 to £100 a year, that will be success, and that is the intention of this policy, to help hard-working families on ordinary incomes who are just about managing.
Well done, you've got all of the slogans in there
In a
at the
stable
end.
and
Thank you very
strong
much.
way.
And I can almost guarantee we'll all be here in a year's time.